Good evening, this is woodblock printmaker Dave Bolt, here at my desk on the second floor of our building in Asakusa, Tokyo. What's this printmaker doing with headphones on? Well, those of you who have been watching our live streams already know the answer. I've been recording voiceovers for the video scenes you are about to watch. The content this time is something that I promised at the end of the previous video. It's the proofing work on the initial designs in the subscription series for 2022, Embrace the Delight. That part of the video work was done well over a month ago, so this all should have been issued before now, but I didn't publish it right away because I had a great idea for how to make it better. I would hold on to all those clips of my own work, and then when the Mokuhankan printers started work on the main edition itself, I would shoot additional footage of their work and then mix it together with mine. I would be able to spend much more time on camera setting, positioning, getting the lighting all right, and could thus create a more carefully produced and hopefully more interesting presentation. Well, it was a good plan. But when it came time to shoot Suga-san while she printed, and she's the one who agreed to take part this time, it turned out that I had overlooked something important. She had looked at my test prints and the notes I had left, studied the block set, and then made her printing plan. And that plan involved making the print in a completely different printing order than I had used. That meant, of course, that it makes no sense at all to interleave her footage with mine, because viewers would just get completely confused by what they were seeing. Why is there blue here when Dave hasn't even printed it yet? So it was on to plan B, or perhaps C or D by now. Rather than interleave our footage into a single start-to-finish sequence, I thought it might be an opportunity to try something different. Let's separate them and let's see it twice. Let's watch how I did it during the early proofing session, and then how Suga-san did it once real production printing had started. And along the way, we'll learn something about why she decided to do things differently and what ramifications that had for the work and for the result. So that's the approach I took in the editing. But as I was going through this and playing back bits and pieces of it as part of this editing process, I learned something really interesting. I've been working in this traditional printmaking field for more than 40 years now, and I'm not so bad at the craft of putting pigment onto paper. Actually, let's be straight here, I'm pretty good at this. But as I watched the clips of Suga-san doing exactly the same job I had done just a few minutes earlier, I'm talking about a few minutes in video time here, I was struck by the difference in what I was seeing. I had done the job okay. Paste, bit of pigment, pick up the brush, rub it together. Nothing wrong. Isn't that what Suga-san did? Well, yes, but with a completely different feeling and mood. She is a production printer at work. There are no wasted motions. As one hand is finishing up one part of the process, the other hand is already starting the next step. There's no stop, start, stop, start. Everything runs together into a fluid process. So it dawned on me that this was a chance to really show everybody the wonderful rhythm of a professional printer's work. So I went back and re-edited much of what I had already done. I had been showing the actions. Put the pigment on, start brushing, but then cut because it's too long. Show the end of the brushing, put the paper on, start rubbing, cut because it's too long. Just show the end of the rubbing, and so on and so forth. We see all the actions, but we don't get any sense of what really happens. So, as I said, I threw out the cuts and just let it run. You see every stroke of her brush and barren. Now, we have learned that these days so many people are using our video material to actually train themselves in printmaking. It seems to me that a real-time approach like this should be hugely valuable. The upshot of all this is that the finished video became a bit long. Whether that's a bug or a feature depends on your point of view, I guess. I'll prepare a table of contents and include it in the YouTube description, and this should result in chapter markers appearing in most video players, so that you can skip around to whichever section you prefer to watch. There's also a bit of bonus content at the end. I was able to convince her to sit together with me for a short chat about making this print, and as I mentioned before, why she did it in a different way from my approach. One final thing to note before we start. I did make a mistake in my scheduling for getting all this done, and on the very day she started her printing work, I was still out in our Ome shipping center, so I missed filming her work on the key block. So we'll have to start her sequence with her initial color block, and we'll then continue from there all the way to the end. I did catch everything else. Enough talk already, let's get to the blocks. As always, with prints in the ukiyo-e tradition, the work begins with the key block. People watching are always surprised by this, as the assumption is that the colors being printed later would thus cover up part of these lines. As you will see in a few minutes, this doesn't happen. This black is stronger than the colors, which for the most part are transparent and will show clearly all the way through. But there is another very important reason for us to do the line work first, and this is of course the issue of registration. There is no way that we could possibly get the colors in the proper location without having the key printed first as a guide. So there we are, 1 down, 17 to go. The clips we are watching in this presentation were taken during my proofing session. A couple of days before, I had done a quick run through with just 4 sheets of paper, basically to confirm that the block set was indeed usable and that there were no major issues. I just banged on colors that were at hand in the printing room. But for this session, I needed to end up with a real print. Filming of the year-end update video was already late, and as I would be announcing this new series in it, I of course needed some presentable prints to show. Because this is proofing, with the final appearance of the print yet to be decided, the block set has not been totally cleaned up. Do you see here the yellowish area of wood in a kind of an L shape, with unused wood left in the other area? That unused wood is actually too close to the yellow. It's going to be difficult for the printer to avoid getting smears of color on it. But I have left it at this point as a kind of insurance backup. If it turns out that we need more colors, more carving, we might perhaps need that area. If it turns out that we're okay with the current set, this zone will be chopped off before production printing begins. And later in this video, when you watch Suga-san print this same block, you will indeed see this unwanted zone is gone. Here's something else that might need explanation. Look at the strange location of the registration marks. Why aren't they down at the edge of the block in the normal place? I cut the block in this way because of the wood grain. there is an area of this piece, the part closest to me, that has a very poor surface quality, with a grain pattern that is very likely to transfer to the printed image. But luckily, the wood was wide enough that I was able to find a cleaner area. Here's our first gradation. There will be many on this print. We'll look at the blue damping pad in more detail later. Here, just note that it is used to lightly moisten the surface of the wood. The recipe for gradation is simple. Paste in the area where the color is to fade out, pigment in the strongest area, and then horizontal brushing with a touch of circular motion to move the pigment down the wood bit by bit. And one important point about gradations, the rubbing is not only on the area of color. You rub vigorously over the entire surface, well past the area where the color will be visible. This block for greens is a work in progress at this point. I had known that I wanted at least 2 green shades, one for the upper group and a different tone for the lower group, but I had miscalculated one small area. You can see it there, a small triangular zone. I had discovered in the previous testing that it really shouldn't have been on this block. As you will see later, by the time this block set gets to Suga-san, a fresh area has been carved for that, using one of those insurance areas that I talked about a minute ago. Look at this. I'm still using cups of pigment that I scavenged from the other printers' desks. I wanted a darker shade of green here, but couldn't spoil their mix, so I added that little bit of black separately. For production printing, of course, fresh bowls of the proper tint are always prepared. Watch the barren rubbing here. There's nothing random about this. A light touch to set it in place, and then Zone 1. Zone 2, Zone 3, nothing random at all. I've been showing the pigment bowls. Have you noticed something important? The color in the bowl, it's always rich, rich and deep, and yet the appearance on the print can be very, very light. In this tradition, we never lighten pigments by mixing with white. We simply apply everything in small quantities. It's the white of the paper showing through the transparent mix that does the lightening for us. Here, a quick wipe to avoid staining the print on the registration mark. You'll see Suga-san use a different method later in the video. We've seen this before, the same L shape with insurance wood left in place. And this time we did indeed later on use that area, as you will see later on when Suga-san prints this same piece of wood. Now, something a little bit different on this one. We have one color in the bowl, and we will print that color, but we will see two colors appearing on the print. There's a fox in this image, and he has already been printed with a base tone, the same yellowish tint that was used for his partner, the cat. We will now print this new color on top of that base tone, so I needed to mix something that would produce the proper fox color in combination. There's no fox color in the bowl, but a fox color ends up in the print. Now I said two colors will appear in this print because the block isn't just for the fox. One of our characters is holding an umbrella, and that area didn't have the previous yellow undertone, so it appears in the print just as it did in the bowl. It's perhaps time to talk about the three cups. Pigment on the right, of course, as you can see. The center cup contains our paste. It's a starch paste mixed to be quite runny. The applicator is simply a piece of disposable chopstick. The paste just hangs on to the end of it. The leftmost cup is just water. It's usually not needed during a normal production run because the pigment is prepared to the proper consistency. But the printer finds that the color impression is starting to get a bit too deep. It would be easy to adjust that by using some of this water to thin out the pigment mix. And here we are. At this point, I'm wondering why on earth I included that light little green area on this block. Anyway, nothing to do at this point, just work around it. We'll cut this off before production begins. This one, it's another perfect example of the difference between the color in the bowl and the color on the print. We have a block here to print a very light gray, but we're starting with a rich black. What's that expression I remember from many years ago? A little dabble do ya. Again, no random rubbing. I first target the wide area of shadow in the fox's bath, then a couple of areas in the bottom zone, and finally, extremely softly, those whiskers. Ah, here we go again. That brown bowl was borrowed pigment from one of the neighboring benches. I wanted a more reddish tinge to the brown, and I would be in big trouble if I put my red directly into that cup. There's also a lot of insurance wood left on this block, the entire area up at the top left. Much of it will end up being chopped away later before production printing. This little waterfall is the simplest impression of this entire print. I'm doing it separately here just to keep the sequence clear for everybody. But in production, the printer could easily do this at the same time as the neighboring blue gradation we saw earlier, using a separate brush, of course. Here we are, this block's coming back for the third time. Suga-san won't have to fiddle around like this. She will have a freshly carved zone for this small green area. Okay, time to inspect our little damping pad. The core is just a little block of varnished wood. We have them in various sizes and shapes. Suga-san prefers to use a strip of cotton cloth to wrap it. I find these strong shop towels to be completely suitable, and they don't shed small threads, as the cotton sometimes does. After wrapping, it needs to be moist, but not completely soaked. Just squeeze off the water here. One very important point is that the damp pad must be used in exactly the same orientation every time, or the pigment will end up everywhere. And when it goes back onto its tile, it has to go back to exactly the same spot. When I was planning the color separations for this, I thought that the water gradation could perhaps be done across two little prints all on one block, but I wasn't able to do that cleanly, so I was required to cut a separate one for this small area. This is an impression that hadn't been planned at the time of color separation. It was only when I saw the result of the initial testing stage that I realized one of the prints on the bottom row was too bare and needed a background tone. That tiniest touch of blue pigment will do it. Some more improvisation here. It's much easier to see the tint when rubbing on the surface of the tile than trying to look down into the bowl. And this of course allows me to test out different tints. If I had put that black directly into the blue bowl and then wanted to change it, I would have had to dump it out and start from scratch. Again, at the production stage, the printer will of course mix the required tint before starting. It seems that I remembered when shooting this video that I was going to have to explain this. I have tightly wrapped a rubber band around the brush about halfway down. This stops the hair from flopping around too much and really helps keep the gradation from spreading out too far. This white paper, it's just a quick fix to mask off the unwanted area. You'll see in Suga-san's version later in this video a much better way to do this sort of masking. Also, this is now the next day and I am no longer alone in the workshop, as you can hear. Carver Chon-san is working in the next room. He does most of his work at home, but for his noisy clearing work with a hammer, his neighbors would complain. They do complain. So he's learned he has to come over here for that part. And here we have it, the first basic proof version of our print. As I mentioned in my introduction, I missed Suga-san's work on the key block, so we are starting this segment with her first color, the Yamabuki yellow on the animals. In the interview at the end of the video, we'll hear her explain why she took this different approach. Did you see the size of that stack of paper? She has just around 100 sheets in her batch, and she's got them in two groups of about 50 each with a hard plastic card in between them. And perhaps you can see here over at her left, sitting on top of her outstack, she has one of my proof copies in a clear folder. And this is her reference copy all the way through her printing. You can see over there on this block, there's one of those insurance areas I talked about, the area that has been carved to print that little triangle of green that was so troublesome during my own proofing. She staggers the sheets in her outstack. This is to help evenly spread the moisture that was added during each printing impression. Stacking them straight up would result in some areas getting too wet and soggy, while other places remained too dry. As you can see, instead of mixing a bit of black in with the green as I did during proofing, she has prepared a proper amount of the tint. There's more than enough in that bowl for her entire run. We always want to avoid remixing partway through. I should mention that little pause she is adding after pulling the paper off the wood is not part of her normal routine. This was my video request. She would normally pull off, then immediately flip it over to her left for a quick glance before slipping it into the stack. This camera angle gives us a chance to see the feet supporting her block. She doesn't use that non-skid material that I typically use. She feels that the block moves around too much and doesn't have any flex. So she uses small pieces of dampened, rolled up cotton. They can of course be adjusted to match whatever shape might be carved on the back side of the block, and they give a very stable feel when you are rubbing with the barrel. We can also see the angle of her printing bench and how this allows her to work, keeping her wrist in a basically straight orientation. Printers like us, we can work all day, every day like this for hours on end and never encounter any wrist pain. Now back at my own proofing, I used a scrap of white paper to block off the unwanted area. Such a sheet would quickly become moist and useless in this production environment. She has rigged up a piece of thin mylar plastic hinged on a piece of tape. Simple, easy to use, and very effective. Look at the level of adjustment here. She wants this paper in place just right. Look at this. Compulsive control behavior? Not at all. Simply, if you want your prints to be executed as perfectly as possible, you have to live and breathe exactness. This is her version of the moistening pad for gradations. As I mentioned, hers is a strip of clean cotton cloth wrapped around a piece of wood. This is another improvisation. For very small gradations, she wants better control than that larger block of wood will offer. So just a little tiny roll of cloth will do the job. Here is another protector. She wants to keep the registration mark there from picking up pigment. In my group, you saw me pick up a tissue and wipe that spot after brushing. Suga-san, she doesn't get it dirty in the first place. It's perhaps not apparent at first, but she has been wrapping and re-wrapping the cloth on that moistening block. The pigment tends to creep into the gradation, so it's important to keep an eye out for that and wrap fresh cloth into place as required. Look at this. That unwanted little green area still hasn't been cleared away yet. All three of the ladies who pulled editions from this block just pushed through and worked around it. They should have called me to get up there with a chisel and take it out. After much experimentation, we settled on using titanium white for this block rather than the traditional gohun. The white is mixed in the bowl with a touch of liquid Nikawa glue, and it leaves an interesting half-transparent impression, just right for the steam above the bath. Not sure if you can see it here, but the white steam changes its appearance as the angle of the paper changes. Suga-san told me later she had actually planned on finishing off with the white steam layer, but forgot this little blue zone, the waterfall. So she had to add it last. And the last one doesn't need to go in the plastic wrapping because it will now go out for drying. Aren't they beautiful? Suga-san、どうも、Thank you very much。申し訳ない、仕事中にその時間で。
大丈夫ですよ。
今日何を作ってますか、今日は。
今日はこっちの GJ の5月ですね。
2年前のシリーズの。
そうですね。2年前の
大変ですか、簡
ジェイドさんの。
単ですか。
ちょっとやっぱり重ねが多いんで、久しぶりなんでちょっと気をつけながら髪を乾かしたり示しの具合を変えたりして、はいやってます。
じゃあ大きさじゃなくて色の数が
数
多くなるとどのような問題になりますか。
やっぱり重なりが多いと、髪がこう歪んできたりもありますし、あと動作の加減ですけどジャンコになるのを気をつけないといけないかなと。でもそれも調節しながら、うまく頑張ってます。
そう、今年のシリーズを考えたときにそのことも考えたんですね。去年のシリーズは結構色の重ねが多いですから、今年のシリーズはもうちょっと浮世絵っぽい。色があんまり重ねないようなものですね。今ちょうど終わったところですが、僕の見本ありますが、杉さんの出来上がりもありますから。
はい、私の方もできてますね。やっとすり上がりました。
じゃあ去年先のシリーズと比べるとどの考え？
やっぱりですね、浮世絵に近いっていうのもあると思うんですけど、ジェドさんの作品にしても多くて重なりが多いのは3色ぐらい重なる部分があるけれども、浮世絵の方も2回くらいしか重なるところがないんじゃないかっていうぐらいやっぱり重なりが少ない感じだったので、
だからさっきの作品と一番大きな違いは細かさでしょ。
細かさですね。
さっき見たとどう
細かい。いやこれ検討が大変だと思ってどうしようと思いましたけど、やっぱりちょっとすり方を考えないといけないなと思って、する順番とかも考えて、ちょっとこう見当がこう遠くになればなるほど、厳しいなと思いました。
本当に5枚だけか、全部で10枚入れて考えたんですね。10枚入れると時間が随分少なくなりますが、見当の問題が厳しくなるかな。ですが本当に3年、レイちゃんもヒカルさんもスグさんの分、私全部もう用意したんですが、見当問題全然なかったんでしょ。
すごいこうなんか考えながら、頭でどうやったらずれないようにできるか考えたんですけど、よかった です。
やっぱり僕出来上がり見たと、
はい
私の順番、色順番
はいはい。
とすぐさんがやった色順番が全然
あ
変わったんでしょ。
ああ、そうですね。
僕は
そう
広いところを
はいはい。
先に色を入れたんです。
はい、面の広いところですね。
すぐさんが逆に、
逆に小さい細かいところからやりました。
なぜ？
私は。やっぱりここが見当になるんですけど、
はい、
鍵の見当になるんですけど、近いところの方が髪の伸び縮みとか、そういうこう歪みとかっていうのが少ないので、なるべく見当から遠いところのこの細い柄のところとか、こう例えばこうちっちゃいこのひげっていうかこの線のところとかを先に順番で吸って、それから手前の方を後でっていうふうに、はい、すりました。
まあ石川さんも話したんですね。ベータの方を
はい、
強いバランス使いますから、その時髪がちょっとストレッチングずれることありますから。
そうですね。
じゃあすぐさんも細かいものを先に入れて一番細かい見当、その後はベータのもの。
そうですね。そういう順番ですりました。
OK。
そうですね。一応それでやっていくと、なんとかうまく、こっちにずらして合わせて、あとは大きいものを後でするとなって大丈夫だったかなと思います。
どうですか。これから一年中でしょ。
はい。
毎月このような細かいものがありますから。
はい。いやー、結構見当が毎回厳しいかなと思うんですけど。まあ、絵の感じがまた変わってくると思うので、それに合わせて
これも楽しいですよ。毎月どのような絵が出てくると楽しみでしょ。
楽しみですね。
僕も分からない。僕5月まで見たんですが、6月何になると
分からないんですか。
分からないですよ。まだ決まってないです。
私もでも次何するのか分からないですし、あとジェドさんのなんかどういうふうに変わっていくのかなっていうのがちょっと楽しみですね。はい。
先日都市の水師、チームのメンバーの別の人ですから、彼に話すときに私がマッチとか今年マッチ作りますよと話します。彼の最初のマッチ彼の頭の中にマッチというものが戦前のジャンプ、一番安い、あんまり丁寧な仕事じゃないです。彼が木版館があのようなものを、
ちっちゃいものを、
そうで僕いい考え逆でしょ。木版館であのような古いジャンルで丁寧に作るといい商品になるかなと思ったんですね。
すごい繊細で小さくて細かくて、それでちょっと可愛い、今までにないちょっと魅力がありますよね。なんか
楽しみにかな。
そうですね。
このジャンルがもうほとんど100年戦前でしょ。100年、まあ80年と100年の間に寝ちゃったでしょ。今このものがもう蘇ると言いますか。
そうですね。
楽しみに。
そうですね。昔のやつをジェドさんとデビッドさんでこうやってうまく楽しくなるっていうのがすごい楽しみですね。もうとにかくなんかこのちっちゃいのも吸ってて楽しくって可愛い、絵が可愛いので、なんかこれからまた楽しみだなと思いますね。
1年楽しみにやりましょう。
ですね。はい。
今話した間に聞きました？バレエの音とかなんか竹の音ありました。
そうですね。なんか隣で吸ってる人がいるかな。
キャメラマン、はいはい。もしもし。
ちょっと待ってくださいね。
仕事中です。
仕事中でした。
来てる人いるかもしれないです。こっちの方があゆみさんですよ。
はい、どうもです。
何年前このビデオによく出たんですが、保育園に子供2人、お子様です。お子様2人に預かってますから、あゆみさんがもうこの仕事に戻りました。
はい、またね、今年10年目なんで、木版館に。
10年目。
はい、ちょうど10年目。
もう本当に子供の時でしょ。嘘じゃないです。子供の時から始まった。
そうなんですよ。
ちょっとちょっと見せてください。
そうですね。
はいはい。さっきすぎさんがちゃ細かいものを作ったんですから、あゆみちゃんが今本当に力がかかるものを作って。
熱い。汗かきながら
汗かいちゃうよ。
キャメラの方にちょっと向いて。
はい。見えます。
覚えてる人いました？ そうそう、徳川時代の茶碗。
茶器
で
ね。
も何、疲れてたのか。じゃあ冬の仕事ちょうどいいですか。
暖房切ってちょうどいいです。
ちょうどいい。
じゃあ窓開けてもいいんですよ。
あ、そうですね。外でやりましょうか。
今日はちょうど2人とも。
OK、じゃあどうぞ戻ってください。
はい、ありがとうございます。
Okay, everybody, thank you very much for watching this. We'll be back soon with the next video, I hope. Thank you very much. チュミさんもありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
はい、thank you.
はい、ありがとうございました。